So up to this point, we have installed VirtualBox and Vagrant, configured those. We've got our Puppet repo that's got our Vagrant file in it that allows us to run a local puppetmaster and a Debian server running the Puppet agent that talks to that puppetmaster. So now we're actually ready to write Puppet code. So it was a lot of work to get to that point, right? We could have just started writing Puppet code from the very beginning, but doing it this way allows us to write code that we can test, and then we can mess up, and then we can destroy our environment, we can start over. So even though this way was slower to get started, it's going to be much, much faster in the long run because we'll be able to make the mistakes locally on our hard drive, and there's only the loss of a little bit of work. If you do it the other way, you find those mistakes when you try to go to production, and you take down production servers, and then you lose all the work that you've done, plus you lose your time recovering, plus the time of everyone who has to drop what they're doing and jump in and help you recover. So this feels like the long way, but over time, it's actually the faster way. Okay, so we're going to put our text editor together. I'm using the Atom text editor, and you get it from atom.io, and you don't have to use it, it's just the one that I like to use, and we're going to do a couple things to make it work a little bit better. First thing we want to do is add some plugins. So I'm going to go into the settings. I'm going to add syntax highlighting for the Puppet language so that as I'm typing out the Puppet code that everything gets highlighted in different colors to make it easier to read. So I'll install that, and while that's installing, I'm going to install a linter. And if you haven't used a linter before, a linter helps you conform to the style guidelines for the particular language that you're writing in. For example, Puppet has its own style guidelines that just determine things like the format of how things should be written, how variables should be declared, how classes should be structured, and there's a whole bunch of rules around that, and using a linter just highlights the places where your code doesn't conform to that. So it's not that your code's wrong, it's just that it doesn't conform to the guidelines. And by conforming to the guidelines, it helps you reduce the number of bugs that you write and make your code a little bit easier for everyone else to read. So we're going to install the linter. So that's going to add linting support to Atom specifically, and then we're going to add a linter specifically for Puppet code, and we'll install that. All right, so in our Atom text editor, we installed Puppet language syntax highlighting, we installed a linter, and then we installed a Puppet linter for Puppet code. The Puppet linter requires a package called Puppet lint to do the linting. So Atom doesn't actually do the linting, it uses this gem. So we've got to install that gem, so we're going to do gem install puppet-lint. And I'll give you guys all of these commands when we're done. And I also want Puppet installed locally, all right? And I'll show you why in just a minute. So I'm going to do gem install puppet. To do our test, we're going to use rspec. So we'll do puppet install rspec. And then the final one that we need, rspec-puppet, which is the rspec add-on specifically for testing Puppet code. Okay, so we set up our text editor, and then we installed the necessary Puppet code pieces that we needed to do our Puppet code, write our Puppet modules, and test our Puppet modules. So we're actually ready to write code. Look at the Git repo that I'm in. I'm on the master branch, so I'm going to create a new branch called training, go into my modules directory. And the reason I installed that Puppet gem was for this feature right here. We're going to do Puppet module generate wheel button dash training. So whenever you create a Puppet module, there's two pieces to it. There's your name followed by a dash and then what the module does. And the reason you do it that way is because if this turns out to be a module that you want to share with other people, you're going to upload it to the Puppet Forge. The Puppet Forge is an online repository of Puppet modules written by people all over the world. And when you upload it, it goes in under your name followed by what the module does. So whenever you do the module generation, you just start with that naming format right away. And then it's going to ask us some questions about what version using semantic versioning. And everything in the brackets here are the default options that it's offering. So if you just hit enter without anything, that's what it's going to put in. Who wrote it is me. The license, if you have a specific open source or non-open source license you want to use, you can put that in here. Put in a description. Source code repository, it's going to be in the Trax Technologies repo, in the Puppet, or Trax Technologies organization in the Puppet repo. And to file issues, you would go to jira.traxtech.com. And so you can see it creates a little JSON object with all of the information that we put into it. And then it uses that to create our module. So that created a module called training. So if I go into that directory, because this is Ruby, we need to do a bundle install first thing. So we generated our module, we filled out our metadata to show the owner and description of it, went into that directory, and now we're doing a bundle install so that Ruby can install all of the dependencies for this module. So now it's complete. We're using rspec for our test. So the first thing we want to do is see if we have a passing test. And we don't. So if you look right here, it says training with default values for all parameters should contain the class training. And I don't really know why it breaks right off the bat, but I do know how to fix it, so that's good enough for me right now. We're going to go into the spec. Let's see, let me do this. If I do a ls to show you, there are some folders here. One of those folders is called spec. So if we go into spec, and inside of that is a folder called fixtures. And if we do an ls there, it shows manifest and modules directory. What this is meant to do is mimic the folder structure of your Puppet repository so that it can, whenever your Puppet tests run, whenever the rspec tests run, they can find the necessary modules. The way that the rspec generates this folder is broken right off the bat. So we're going to do a remove directory and remove the modules directory, and then symlink it to the modules directory for our repo, and then just give it the same name of modules. So now if I do rspec, our test passed. So one example, one failure. But we don't really know what that means, right? So let's go over to our Atom text editor. We can close this, go into modules. This is just opened up to our Puppet repository. If we scroll down here, here's the training folder that contains our new Puppet repository. And we've got some folders in here. We've got the spec folder, and the way that rspec works is you'll see there's in the classes folder there's a file called init_spec.rb, and then under my manifest folder is a file called init.pp. So the way that rspec works is whenever you run rake spec to run your tests, it looks in this classes folder, and every file that it sees with the _spec.rb file name, it goes and looks for a class with that name. So in this case, it's got init_spec.rb. It knows that there must be an init.pp file up in the manifest folder that it's supposed to test. So it's sort of magic, and I'm kind of really not a fan of magic whenever it comes to writing code, but this is one of those things where you have to just kind of smile and nod and say, okay, the magic works. All right, so if we look at our init spec, if you haven't written rspec tests before, they're kind of written in a somewhat readable language. We're describing our module training, and then we have the context with the default values for all parameters. It should contain the class training. All right, so we have our class training defined, so that test passes, right? Let's do a couple of things. Let's create a file with our Puppet module. So our Puppet module, when it's applied to a server, we want it to create a file. We want the contents of that file to be hello world. We want to install a package called nmap. We're going to create a user, and then we're going to have that user own our file that we create. All right? Everybody follow that? All right. So when writing code, you always write your test first, right? So the first test we want, it should contain file etctraining.conf. So everybody see how that works? It's just using contain file and then passing in the path name for that file, and that file should exist. So if we go back over to our directory, we can run rake spec, and that test fails, which we expected, right? Because we haven't done anything to actually write it. So now we're going to write the code to make that pass. So we'll go into our init folder and we'll do a file resource of etsy training.conf, and let's see if that's enough to make it pass. There we go, it passed. All right, so that's step one that we wanted to create. We wanted our file etsy training.conf created. The second thing we want to set the contents of the file to be hello world. So let's write that test. And that's a duplicate, so we'll get rid of that. And let's see if I wrote that right. So we'll run our test. So it failed. It says should contain the file etsy/training.conf with the contents hello world. So I saved that, and you can see there were two little things that popped up down here, and these are from the linter. Remember I said the linter helps us write Puppet code that follows to the style guidelines. So if we look at this, it says error trailing white space found. So it doesn't actually break anything, but it doesn't conform to the style guidelines. So if we erase that, so that clears that error. If we go to this one, it says a double quoted string contains no variables. In Puppet syntax, you only use double quotes if you have a variable inside that string, and we don't. So we'll replace that with just the single quotes. And then it looks like we have one more. That one says there's missing the trailing comma after the last element. And this one tends to confuse a lot of people because what it wants is that comma right there. So we've got, this is an object, right? It's an object defined by the curly brackets. Inside the object we have our attributes, so we can do the contents and we can do the owner, and each of those are going to be listed in there separated by commas, right? So if I only have one item, why do I need the comma there? And the reason is so that later, if I add a second line to this, I'm going to need the comma. And whenever I look at the diff for that, for whenever somebody pushes that diff in there or does a PR or however it comes up, if I had to add that comma there, this would show up as a changed line. But if I already have the comma there, then whenever I look at the diff, the only thing that shows up on the diff are the lines that actually changed. So it just helps make your future diffs easier to read, so you're not looking at lines trying to figure out why they would change. You would have to look at this and say, oh, it changed because we add the comma. Well, by putting the comma in there initially means that it's never going to show up as an issue. Make sense? All right.
This puppet handles it even if you have an extra comma in it.
Yep, Puppet will handle it either way. It'll do the right thing with the comma. It'll do the right thing without the comma. It's just the guidelines are to always add the comma so that future diffs are easier to read. All right, so now let's run our test again and see if I wrote the right code. Oh, I didn't. Damn it. Oh, because you know what? It's not contents, it's content. But let's do it even better. Let's say that we don't know. Let's go find out. If we go to the Puppet reference and look at the type reference, this shows you all the different things that Puppet knows how to create. So we were creating a file, so if we click on File, and here are all the attributes for the file, you can see right there it's content, not contents plural. So I corrected that, and I need to go back over and remove this. So now let's try our tests, and it passes. We created a file, we've tested for the right contents of the file. Next, let's install a package. Does that sound like a good idea? Yeah? All right. Glad you guys agree. So we'll do it should contain package. And we're just going to install nmap. Not that nmap has anything to do with anything other than the fact that I was just looking for a package that I knew wouldn't be installed on my vagrant machine. So we'll do a rspec to run our tests. And the last one fails because it should contain a package nmap. So now we'll write the code to make that pass. And it's the same format. We specify our resource to ensure latest. And that passes. Okay, so let's create a user now. You guys picking up on the pattern here? So it should, and it's going to be contain underscore user. So that should fail, right? Because the user doesn't exist, and it did fail, so now we can write the code to create that user. And let's see if that passes it. And it does. And so this is probably getting pretty boring at this point, right? So you guys are picking up how it works. So let's do one more thing here. What if we've got our etsy/training.conf file? What if we want that to be owned by our user buff overflow? Well, I guess the first question is, who is it actually owned by initially, right? So to answer that, we'll type vagrant up to bring up my virtual boxes. Because at this point, we've only been writing code and testing the code locally. We haven't actually pushed it out to any machine, right? So let's push it out and see what it looks like. And that'll give us a way to test to see that it actually worked and see that it actually created those pieces. All right, so I'm going to go into agent 1. Oops. So if we look in our Etsy folder, there's no training.conf file, right? Well, we need to apply the class that we wrote, and that class is named training, right? So if we do this, that's going to cause Puppet to compile the class for this server. Puppet agent-t again. And so you can see right here, it created the file etsytraining.conf. So if we do cat etsytraining.conf, you can see that the contents of it are hello world. And then our question that we started to ask before I got sidetracked was, who owns that file? And the answer is root. We want that file to be owned by our user that we created. So in here, we're going to break out inside of our file definition, and we're going to say owner should be buff.overflow. So let's run our tests and see if that works, or doesn't work, as the case may be. And so that failed as expected because the owner should be defined and it's not, right? So let's fix that. Start a new line. And so that does that, but we get another error here, and it says the indentation of the fat arrow is not properly aligned. So the way that Puppet likes to see the code, this is perfectly valid code, but Puppet likes to see it aligned like that, so that these fat arrows are lined up, and that's just something that it pulls in from Ruby, and that's the way Ruby likes everything, so that it's all nice and symmetrical. Okay, so let's go run our rake tests. All the tests pass, and the ultimate test is if we do a Puppet run here, and you can see it changed the user there. So if we look at that again, you can see that the owner was changed from root to buff overflow. So there's one other problem with this though. Anybody got any ideas what it is? What if when we set this owner to buff overflow, what if that user doesn't exist on the system? We've defined the user down here, but there's nothing that guarantees that that user creation piece is going to happen before the file creation. So let's write our test. We want to require, and the way that you specify that in rspec is going to be using the brackets. So what I did there is we're going to use the require attribute, and then in Puppet, using a capital letter and the name of a Puppet reference type tells that you're calling a specific reference type. So in this case, we want the require statement to reference a specific user named buff overflow. Does everybody follow that? Okay, so let's run our rake test again, and it should fail because we don't have that require code built in, and it does. So if we go back over here, we can create a new line. Can do a require, and then we'll do a user, open the square brackets, and then specify the object that we want to reference. Include our comma, right? Run our test should pass. All the tests pass. Let's do one more Puppet run, and nothing should actually change at this point. And now the cool thing about Puppet is when you run Puppet as a service, it's going to run every 30 minutes. So every 30 minutes it's going to do this Puppet run. So if someone comes along and decides that they don't need that Etsy training.conf file anymore. It's gone, but the next time the Puppet run kicks off, remember Puppet's all about state management. Puppet says the state of that file should be that it exists. And the file didn't exist, so Puppet said, well, I know how to create it, and so that's exactly what it did. And it'll continue to do that over and over and over every 30 minutes when Puppet runs. And that is how you create Puppet modules. Any questions?
Did we install Puppet in the agent machine or in our local machine?
So whenever I typed gem install Puppet, that installed just the Puppet gem within my workstation. So it gave me the ability to access the Puppet command. It's not actually running Puppet, and it's not configured as like an agent or a puppet master. It only allows me to run the Puppet command.
Okay, but we have in the agent machine, we already have Puppet in there.
Mm-hmm.
Through provisioning, is that through provisioning or?
Yeah, so during the provisioning, we install the Puppet agent, and Puppet agent is configured to talk to the Puppet master in our vagrant box. And then whenever we did the gem install Puppet on here, that just gives us the ability to access the Puppet command, so that the command Puppet itself exists on our local hard drive. It doesn't actually do anything. It just gives us access to generate modules and things like that. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
So, I observed that the way you code is do a test and then implement the code. Because normally for us, for me, I gonna create a code and run a test. So it's the other way around. Is there a reason why we much better to do that? Or?
Yeah, it's called test-driven development, and the way that you always do it is you write the test first, write the failing test first, and then write the code to make it pass. There's a couple reasons behind it. One is by writing the test first, you always know that the test is valid. Sometimes if you write the code and then write the test after, you think you're testing the right thing, but you're actually testing something else. So by writing a test that fails first, you know that that test is going to continue to fail until you write the correct code to make it pass. The other thing is it helps keep you focused. By writing the test first, you have to get very, very specific about what it is you're trying to accomplish here, because you have to write something that tests whether that is successful or fails or not. So it forces you to think about your application flow before you start writing code, and then it keeps that code writing process very focused, because instead of getting off in this frenzy where you're just writing code for hours and you end up writing a bunch of code that you may not need because you got sidetracked, you only write enough code to make that test pass. And we were very granular with this. You know, we started with, does the file exist? And then I wrote only enough code to create the file. I knew right from the beginning that the file had to have the contents hello world in it, but I didn't write that because that's not what the test said. The test said, does the file exist? So we only wrote that piece of code. And then once that was passing, we went to the next stage of our application development, which was, do the contents say hello world? And they didn't, so then we wrote the code to make that pass. Any other questions?
If I just want to stop, don't want to run, want to stop it, so I will just go to the new file and remove it from there, right? So the Puppet will now keep and creating the file we did it before training come.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So if you don't want that module applied anymore,
So we just remove it from there.
just
right?
remove it from the classes array.